Michael Brown, the former FEMA director during, of course, Katrina. And Michael, we were chatting yesterday, but I want to update you on some things. That Rockport looks like the first serious damaged area from this hurricane that we know of. We're getting more as we go deeper into the state. But what was interesting about Rockport, as you probably know, Michael, is that acting mayor there was telling those who refused to evacuate, do me a favor and put your Social Security and name on your arm in case we have to identify your body. What did you make of that?
Well, look, there's a part of me that says that's the reality, and the mayor was probably correct in saying that. That's the harsh reality. What worries me, though, is that gets spread out by the media to everybody, and then people around the country think, oh, that's hyperbole and that's an overreaction. Well, it may be an overreaction to somebody sitting in Los Angeles or New York, but for that local community, he's exactly right, because they can't afford to put the first responders in harm's way. You and I have had this conversation for years now. Do you want to be the guy that ends up causing a first responder to be either injured or lose their life because you were too stupid to get out of the storm? I don't think so.
But
so
you
the
know,
mayor was
you were
probably
that
right
guy.
in doing that.
I think history has been very unkind to you, and I've raised this before, but you were the guy who, contrary to the press reports at the time, were warning administration and other officials about the danger of approaching storms, flooding, all the stuff that later came to pass in New Orleans and elsewhere. But they always say to those who get that dramatic, or at least paint that potentially devastating a picture, that they're being crepe hangers or alarmists. How do you balance that?
Well, and here's the problem. And let me go back to what, maybe I wasn't clear enough earlier, but I think for that mayor to do that in his city was the right thing to do. The problem is that we live in the, in a 24/7 news cycle. Right. So that story gets picked up by people, and they hear it in Los Angeles and New York, or they hear it in Denver, and they think, oh, that's crazy. No, it may be crazy for you in Los Angeles to hear that and not understand it, but in that locality, that was precisely the right thing to say.
Yeah, what he was trying to say is, think twice before just sticking around. One of the things you always deal with, and you and I touched on this before too, is you have so many competing interests in various agencies, individuals, politicians, all supposedly dealing with the same sort of issues and all rivaling each other. The rap against the federal government in this case is that so many key positions are being filled by either, an acting administrator or someone who, in the case of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has an acting person in charge because a full-time replacement hasn't been named. The director of the National Hurricane Center, that's a position that remains vacant. The office of the branch chief of the NHC Hurricane Specialist Unit, that remains vacant. Now, a lot of the key posts are filled by a FEMA acting administrator, all of that. So I don't take anything away. Nothing seems to be untoward or not working. But how does that come into play here?
Because let's go back to Katrina for a second. You and I have had this same conversation also. One of the things that I told all of my political appointees, because they're the ones that can take this risk, I said you've got to push the envelope, and if that means you've got to break a rule, you've got to break a regulation, you've got to violate some law, I really don't care. Do it. The goal has to be doing whatever it takes. The problem is, and this is not meant to bash the permanent civil service, but it's difficult to say to a bureaucrat, I want you to break the law. I want you to break a rule. I want you to break a regulation. I want you to do whatever it takes to get X done. You can say that to a political appointee and hold them accountable. And as I told my staff during Katrina, look, I'll take the blame for it. They can haul me through Congress. I'll testify, blah, blah, blah. You can't really do that to a permanent civil service employee. So my concern is, as we go through this storm, and look, I'll jump ahead for just a second. The real seriousness of this storm is going to be the flooding that we're going to see over the next several days.
Right.
And that's going to be that will be difficult for the media to cover, because you can't really get the great visuals of a flood because you can't get into the middle of the flood. So the staff at FEMA is going to have to lean forward and say to their people, you might have to break some rules here. We might have to say this policy goes out the window, just like a general will tell you that the plan goes out the first shot that's fired. Well, when you don't have the political appointees in place that are willing, capable, and able of doing that, then you have people starting to second guess, looking over their shoulder, hesitant to do the things that you actually have to do to make things work. Right.
Real quickly, the president wants to visit Texas next week. How would you advise him on that?
You know what? I know he wants to. As I told you yesterday, there should be a White House advance team with Brock Long right now so that they can decide when and where he goes. Depending on, if this storm does what Joe just described and it goes out and strengthens or it goes back up toward Houston, he might be able to go to Rockport, but he won't be able to go to Houston. So it's that balancing act because the president travels with a huge bubble, and that bubble shuts down everything. It shuts down airspace, it shuts down travel, etc.
All right, Brock Long, of course, the acting FEMA administrator. Thank you very, very much. Very good seeing you again.
You bet.